Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of our long form international conversation series. Today, I'm honored to be joined by a remarkable guest, journalist, author, human rights advocate, Yvonne Ridley. Yvonne is someone whose life story sounds like a film script. A journalist captured by Taliban in 2001 who returned to the UK with a spiritual awakening that eventually led her to embrace Islam. Her journey has challenged stereotypes, reshaped public debate, and inspired millions across the world. Since then, she has remained one of the most fearless voices on issues from Western foreign policy to civil liberties, Islamophobia, women's rights, Palestine, Afghanistan, and global media ethics. In today's conversation, we are going to explore her personal journey, the challenges she faced within both media and society, her perspective on current geopolitics, and her thoughts on future, not just for Muslims, but for humanity. So let's dive into a very special episode with Yvonne Ridley. Yvonne, how are you? Assalamu alaikum.
Alhamdulillah, I'm great, Adil, and thank you very much for inviting me onto your show. This is a great opportunity to correct some myths and tell some truths.
Yeah, sure. So, Yvonne, you've often said that your capture in Afghanistan changed your life. Can you take us back to that moment? What shifted inside you?
Yes, I can take you right back to September 2001, and that was a month which changed so many lives. And in fact, to a certain extent, I don't believe America has quite recovered from the horrific events of 9/11. That dreadful day set me out on a journey which would ultimately lead to my conversion to Islam in a story you couldn't invent. I was the chief reporter of the Sunday Express newspaper in London, and I went to Afghanistan undercover to try and find out what life was like for ordinary people under the Taliban. The Taliban at that time had been portrayed as the most evil, brutal regime, much hated by the West. And the regime was portrayed as a backward, barbaric, extremist group of followers of Islam. Of course, there were many reasons for that. And of course, you can't drop bombs on nice people. So once America and its cohort Britain had decided to attack Afghanistan, there was 20 odd days set to totally demonize the regime in every possible way, from extreme stories from tabloid journalists to blatant lies from the so-called serious broadsheet print media, and even the BBC joined in this demonization of the Taliban, so that when the first bombs did drop, very few people in the West shed a tear, and they had been groomed and conditioned by a very powerful propaganda that the Taliban was the most evil, brutal regime in the world. I was one of those propaganda victims because my sojourn into Afghanistan came to an abrupt end when I was captured, and I really didn't think that I would survive the ordeal. And for 11 long, terrifying days, I thought that I would be killed, executed by this brutal regime. But what happened, again, you couldn't make it up. The Taliban treated me with courtesy and respect and left me completely confused at the end of this experience, which I survived.
Remarkable, remarkable, very James Bond like, but extremely remarkable. And this is what true journalism is. You follow the story and you went right into the war zone. I mean, the NUJ needs to teach all this to the newcomers, I would say. But Yvonne, your journey to Islam was intensely personal. What was the hardest part of this transition, spiritually, socially, or professionally? Since people say, well, Yvonne was forced into conversion. Well, you're not forced anymore, are you? But what was the journey personally for you?
You know, I'm a very strong-minded, bullish person, and I wasn't looking for a new religion when I was captured. I was a practicing Christian. I went to church maybe twice a month, which in Britain is bordering on fanaticism. I was quite happy with my life as a Christian. I was the party girl. I smoked, I drank, I went clubbing. I led quite a hedonistic lifestyle, although I wasn't a bad person. But this journey to Islam changed all of that, because I realized during my captivity that Islam wasn't just a religion that was picked up and put down on a Friday, the traditional Muslim holy day. It was something that was practiced 24/7. The Taliban in particular, the way they dressed, the way they ate, the way they conducted themselves, everything was motivated by their faith in the one God. When they entered a room, they would say Bismillah. When they sat down to conduct business, they would say a prayer. Islam was first and foremost in their minds. And I realized then that I couldn't possibly write with any degree of authority or knowledge about Muslims or the faith that they followed without knowing more about this faith. So during my time in captivity, the Taliban invited me to embrace Islam. And it was an offer that I said to them that I couldn't possibly accept, because it would have been seen to be under force. But if they let me go, then I would study Islam. I would read their holy book, and against all the odds, while they held on to other Westerners, they released me on humanitarian grounds. And so I began to fulfill the promise that I had made, and I began to study Islam. A lot of people who are critical of my decision said that I was a victim of Stockholm syndrome. Yeah. But that is a condition where you bond with your captors and you fall under their control. Nothing could be further than the truth. I was held for 6 days in one place by a set of Taliban, and then I was moved for the remaining 5 days to a prison in Kabul, where I was held by another set of Taliban. And such conversion to Stockholm syndrome doesn't happen that quickly. And I was also the prisoner from hell. As fearful as I was, I rebelled against them. I resisted their requests. I fought against them, not physically. I was one person, but I threw things at them. I spat at them. I cursed them. I swore at them. As I say, I was the prisoner from hell, and I went on hunger strike and refused to cooperate with them in any way. And that was a position that I held right up until the point of my release, when I was handed over to the Pakistan authorities on October 7. A significant day in some people's calendar, a very significant day for me.
So you found Islam at your own after coming back, and you converted independently.
Yes, that's right. I am a feminist. I was brought up in a working class area in the north of England where men and women had different expectations of each other, and that sort of radicalized me as a feminist. I was born in an area of heavy industry, mining, shipbuilding, steel making, all male-dominated industries where there was no work for women. We were expected to take up more feminine roles, like cooking and cleaning and nursing, none of which I did. I went on to become a journalist, which was also a very male-dominated area. So my feminism is what drove me. And of course, I ended up being captured by a very chauvinistic, misogynistic regime. And they viewed me as some sort of seed from the devil, very much in the way as I viewed them. There was a complete clash of cultures. I didn't understand them, and they, as sure as hell, didn't understand me. Yeah. So it was a constant clash of cultures. Of course, now I can look back and see through my Western ignorance and arrogance. And today I would react in a much more different way than the Western journalist they held back in 2001.
Yvonne, going back to that time, do you feel that the Islamophobia of that era in which you converted, was it harder for people to understand your decision? Especially, how did your family react to your decision, especially given the political climate after 9/11?
My family were really challenged by this. My late parents were delighted when I said, I've stopped drinking, I've stopped smoking, I no longer go clubbing. I became more focused. They loved that. I wasn't a bad person. I think I was reckless. I was probably reckless and had a lack of self-respect, and which is probably why I put myself into danger in Afghanistan. I just had a lack of regard for my value as a person. So my parents were delighted at this change, but then I put on a hijab and they were horrified. All of their prejudices towards Islam came out. and we had some quite combative exchanges, especially over food. They couldn't understand why I no longer ate bacon sandwiches, why I wouldn't have a glass of wine with a meal. They rebelled and resisted very much against my conversion. One of my sisters stopped speaking to me, and the other was quite supportive, although, you know, she said she couldn't understand why I had changed. The reality is, as my friends found out, I hadn't changed. People changed towards me. I remember after I converted to Islam and going back into my old newsroom, people came running up to me and then stopped short because their instinct was to hug me or to pick me up and touch me, but they stopped short. And I look back now and I see that as a sign of respect, maybe a bit of wariness. Oh, she's a Muslim now. We can't just sort of punch her and treat her like we used to. So people change towards me. I've kept most of my friends because they can see that I am still essentially the same person. I still have this wicked sense of humor and gallows humor. I'm still cynical. I still work as a journalist and I'm very good at it. And I'm still that confident person. I still have an abrasiveness, but it's probably more polished now. And I actually like who I am today, whereas 20 years ago, I couldn't stand my own company. I couldn't sit and relax, whereas now I actually enjoy peace and quiet. And if I am on my own for 2 or 3 days, it doesn't phase me out at all. As I say, I enjoy my company now, and I think that Islam.
Why, Yvonne? Why?
Well, I think Islam has a lot to do with it. It's made me much more introspective, much more inward looking, much more deep thinking. And I quite like that. I understand now, looking back at my behavior, and I just don't think I had any self-respect for myself. As I say, I stopped smoking, not for any other reason than, God gave me this body and I should look after it. And smoking kills, we know that. It's harmful and it's antisocial. And so I decided to stop. It also, you never see a nun smoking. And if you did, you'd look twice. Just in the same way as you rarely see a Muslim woman wearing a hijab smoking. And when I put on the hijab, it was better than any nicotine patch. I just didn't want to smoke. Once I didn't have any real cravings. I found strength through prayer and encouragement from others. So I wouldn't say it was easy to stop smoking, because I went from 40 a day to 0 overnight. And I did the same with alcohol as well. And that surprised a lot of people. I wouldn't say I was dependent on alcohol, but once I started, I wouldn't stop until I probably fell over or stumbled, or but as I say, looking back, I wasn't a bad person. I still had a lot of humanity and felt for other people's suffering.
Yeah, obviously, because guidance comes to, uh, 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 I would say, poise souls, and you always had that. And Yvonne, don't mind me saying, but you seem content, and contentment is a kingdom. And I can relate with you. I've served 21 years in the military, and I used to smoke 40 cigarettes a day. But once, and I was a Muslim, I was born Muslim, so I might not be that much appreciative of the gift I had. Basically it is about what you're saying: introspection, deep thought process, and I mean it gives you the strength as well. But moving back to the media politics in the Tony Blair era, so were you forced after your conversion to conform to a particular narrative about Muslims or foreign policy?
Well, I had my eyes opened as I was reading an English translation of the Quran. It was by A. Yusuf Ali. There was an index in the back, and the Holy Quran that I was given by a Muslim community in London, also had a wider explanation of each ayat and what it meant. And I was amazed by what I was reading. Of course, the first thing that I did, with it having an index in the back, was go down and look for all those chapters that says, how to abuse your wife, how to stop women from being educated, how to force a patriarchal system on women, how to force them into marriage. Of course, I didn't find any of that, but they were the myths that I'd been led to believe. And in fact, with regards marriage, marriage in Islam is like a business contract. It's an agreement between two parties in which, when I got married, I was able to write out my own hopes and expectations of what I wanted from the marriage. And because I didn't have anyone in the family who was a Muslim, I was very much sort of not quite blind in drawing up the contract, but I did put in things that I wanted and I expected. My husband read this, although he says he can't quite remember, but I remind him everything that was written down. And, when you look at what's happening in Hollywood now, when famous people are getting married, they're writing prenup agreements. This was available to women 1400 years ago. Also, women right from that time were allowed to own their own property, run their own business. Our beloved Prophet, peace be upon him, his wife Khadija, she was an international business trader. She ran her own company and she employed Muhammad, peace be upon him. And she, on seeing what a good person he was, she was the one who proposed marriage to him. Of course, it's only recently in Britain, for instance, that a woman can own her own property. Once a woman married 100 years ago, her property became the property of her husband. And this was considered the norm. But Islam gives women so much freedom and liberty. And what I say now when I go around and I talk to a lot of Muslim women and their children, and what I say to them now is, learn your Islam. Because if you know your Islam, you can assert and make your demands. And there isn't a single man alive, a single Muslim man alive, who would go against the word of God or contradict the word of God. And what I would say, especially to Afghan women, is know your Islam and assert your rights. I know it's not as easy for them as it maybe is for me, but the Taliban have absolutely no right in Islam to stop girls from being educated. Absolutely no right at all. And one of the first things that I did when I returned to Afghanistan a couple of years ago was asked to see the education minister. He has since changed. I don't think he's education minister anymore. But I said to him, what is this nonsense that women are not allowed to be educated, that girls can't go to school? And I said, when I was studying Islam, the first word I learned was Iqra, which means read. You know, this is the word of God. How can you contradict God? And of course, he said that he was confident that things would change and that girls would go back to school. I am also confident of that. But I would say to Afghan women, learn your Islam and assert your rights. Don't sit there and say this is a barbaric, primitive regime which doesn't give women a chance. Islam gives women a whole host of chances, and the Holy Quran, which we believe is the word of God, makes it crystal clear that we women are equal in spirituality, worth, and education. And we have to keep knocking on that door in Afghanistan until it opens. And I would say to the West, don't isolate the Taliban, sit down and talk to them and reason with them and trade with them and show them respect. And through that respect will come a greater understanding, and the walls that they have built against the West will eventually come down. And I think that at that point, they will then accept that women, girls should be educated right up to university level. Women can contribute so much more to their society. But at the moment, what the Taliban are doing are sidelining women, trying to airbrush them out of the political landscape. And by doing that, they're shooting themselves in the foot. They're going into battle with one arm behind their back. Because we women are half of the Ummah, and we gave birth to the other half. So, you know, even the most bullheaded Afghan should be able to realize that by silencing women and removing them from the education system is a serious own goal. And I know that common sense will prevail in the end, and that Islam will win in the end, because they are a God-fearing people and they've done so many great things to improve the country. I was able to travel as a lone woman. I had men with me, but I was able to travel the length and breadth of that country and not feel any fear or trepidation wherever I went. The security is back there now. Bombs aren't dropping. People are not being killed and brutalized. So, you know, a lot of good things have happened in that country, and that country will thrive if it is supported by the West, which it isn't at the moment. At the moment, it serves the West's purpose to continue to isolate and sideline the Taliban. And of course, if you continue to isolate and expel people from the international community, then it serves no purpose at all. And in fact, the West is actually punishing the Afghan women further by this isolation policy.
That's true. That's true, Yvonne. So moving over to another contentious topic. You just said that one of your sister stopped talking to you. So you've been an outspoken critic about Tony Blair's legacy, you know, and what do you believe people still misunderstand about the Iraq war and its consequences? And do you think Blair could ever be held accountable for what many call a war of aggression?
The war in Iraq was a lie. It was based on a lie of weapons of mass destruction. What George Bush and Tony Blair were after was regime change, and they might well have got it peacefully had they announced that to the world, but instead they chose to use fear as a weapon. And Tony Blair produced this dodgy dossier which said that Britain was 45 minutes away from being destroyed, attacked in a war, and terrified the life out of gullible souls who believed him. And this is the biggest weapon that the propagandists have, and that is our minds. And it was a South African called Steve Biko who was bludgeoned to death by the apartheid regime in South Africa. He said the greatest weapon of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. And I fully understand this, because for 11 days I had convinced myself that I was going to die, that I was going to be executed by the Taliban regime, that they were evil, brutal, and they hated women. So I had no chance of surviving. Now, bizarrely enough, death holds no fear for me, because for 11 days, that's all I feared. And when I was released, even then, I feared that they would kill me, because when I was released from the people carrier that they drove me down to Pakistan's border, I got out of the people carrier backwards and walked backwards so I could look at the Taliban, because I was sure as soon as I turned my back, they would shoot me in the back. It was only when I met the Pakistan media and they said to me, "How did the Taliban treat you?" that I was able to process what had happened. And I thought they treated me with courtesy and respect, which they did. And it wasn't a lie, it was the truth. It was the truth that I felt. It was the truth that I experienced. And people were furious because, as I said, you know, you can't drop bombs on nice people. And this is what Britain and America had done. They had carpet bombed Afghanistan. They had bombed hospitals. They had bombed nursing homes. They had bombed schools. Of course, this all sounds familiar in 2025, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's what my next question is. That you have been a tireless advocate of Palestinians and of course Afghanistan as well. But what do you make out of the current situation in Gaza?
It is a genocide. I do tend to believe the experts, and more than 3,000 experts, ranging from religious Holocaust scholars to military academics to humanitarian organizations. More than 3,000 experts have said what is happening in Gaza is genocide. And, you know, at the moment we've got this word ceasefire, which is meaningless because hundreds of Palestinians have died in the ceasefire. Israel is a rogue state, and the world is beginning to wake up to this fact. However, there is unconditional support by America and by Britain and some European countries that there is this unconditional support for Israel and the Zionist ideology. Now then, you mentioned Iraq. If you go back in recent history, one person was pushing non-stop for a war in Iraq. And that one person was Benjamin Netanyahu. And he pushed, and anybody can find this who knows how to use the Google search engine and go into old videos. And Benjamin Netanyahu was saying they have weapons of mass destruction.
Destruction.
How to say deception, destruction. They've got WMD. They are the biggest threat in the Middle East. And he went on and on at every speech that he could propose. And then when he got his way, he then started banging the drums of war towards Syria, Lebanon. Everywhere this man was seeing a different enemy who would destroy Israel. And of course, in the end, he said that Hamas was intent on destroying Israel. And he cited the Hamas Charter. But I don't know how many people have actually sat down and read the Hamas Charter. Hamas wants to destroy Zionism, wants to wipe Zionism, obliterate it from the face of the map, wants to Zionism not to exist. But by the time you get to point 32 or 33, Hamas is also talking about making alliances with Jews, with Christians in a world where Muslims can work side by side with Jews and Christians. Now then, if you're obliterating and wiping Jews off the face of the map, how can you then, in the next breath, talk about a relationship with the Jewish people? And of course, not all Zionists are Jews, and not all Jews are Zionists. And that is the difference. I am sick and tired of Zionists accusing people like me of being anti-Semitic. They don't tell you what a Semite is. And the truth is, most European Jews are not Semites. They are not, they're white Europeans. They are not Semitic in the same way as the Arab Jews are, as in the same way that Arab Palestinians and Arab Christians are. So this play on language and this distortion of the language lies behind a lot of these false accusations. And of course, since Gaza, the whole world has turned against Israel. When I say the whole world, I'm talking about citizens of the world, apart from Zionists. And even the 5 million Christian Zionists who swept Donald Trump to power, in fact, there was millions more of them, are now turning against Donald Trump. And this is huge. The MAGA group of supporters are furious that their tax dollars are going to prop up this rogue state which refuses to bow to international law. They are furious that they are paying tax dollars to a country where the Israeli citizens all enjoy free medical care, when many Americans are going round with hernias and with other terrible, painful medical conditions, but they can't afford healthcare. And yet they are paying for Israelis to have this free healthcare that they can't afford. And it's all starting to implode now. So Donald Trump has some really awkward conversations to be had and decisions to make over this rogue state. As I say, I rely on experts. We have experts because we need people to advise us. We have experts in the military. We have experts in medicine. We have experts in science. We have experts who are advising us that the world is in dire straits because of climate change. Now, we either listen to these experts and respect their views, or we go into a situation where we've got people who question vaccinations and are worried about vaccination procedures. And they might have a point, but we do need to listen to the experts as well. Polio was almost eradicated, but it's coming back now because people are afraid to have polio vaccinations.
Yeah.
So, the world is far more complex than it needs to be.
Yeah. Well, coming back to the Israel question, the counter argument is by the strategic community of the UK and the USA. Well, they say, well, listen, Israel is doing our dirty work in the Middle East. They're protecting our strategic interest. And that is why Western governments have struggled or outrightly refused to take a moral stance. Now, Do you think the world is witnessing a collapse of the Western moral authority?
Well, certainly the global south is looking at us. By us, I mean America, Australia, Europe, and starting to look at us in a different way. Wherever you see a straight line on a map, that is a strong indication that imperialists have been there and created these false countries and these fake countries. I mean, you look at Sudan, it's a country that was based on a tribal system. And yet there is a line that's so straight, it was a colonialist ruler that drew that line. And people are looking and starting to say, what happened to the indigenous North American natives, the Indian tribes that lived and ruled in North America, in Canada, and in America, the United States? We look at Australia, what happened to the indigenous population there? And New Zealand, you know, what happened to the Maori people? Of course, the Maoris are now starting to rise up. Thankfully, they weren't all wiped out, and they are starting to resist and make demands. And when you look at what Israel has done, actually what Israel has done, the savagery, the primitive brutality, the genocidal onslaught, it is just following in the footsteps of Britain, America, Belgium, you know, which the massacre in the Congo was on a genocidal scale. And all of these colonialist entities have created this murder and mayhem around the world. And people look at London, you know, London is a great capital city, and the wealth that was spent creating the financial sector, the magnificent buildings, trillions of dollars came from India, which at one time was one of the poorest countries in the world. But once they got rid of the British, India is now has one of the fastest growing economies in the world. Why? Because it's no longer been bled dry by the colonial forces of the East India Company and all the other colonial enterprises that plundered and looted and raided India. And, you know, we feel it here in Scotland. Our resources, the oil, the water, is being plundered and looted by London. And the reality is that if Scotland was allowed to go independent, it would overnight become one of the wealthiest states in the world today, certainly in the top 10. This is colonialism, this is empire, this is imperialism, and the truth about Israel is it is a colonial settler state. It has no right to be in the Middle East. I would go as far as to say it has no right to exist. And people will go, oh, you know, she can't say that. Well, actually, no country has a right to exist. Look at the USSR, which was so strong up until the 70s, and then it disappeared.
Yeah.
It didn't have a right to exist. If every country had a right to exist, then the old Soviet era would still be in force. And a lot of the Eastern European countries wouldn't exist. So we should be very careful when we say this country has a right to exist and this country has a right to. Countries don't have a right to anything. So Israel, well, it's not really Israel, it's the Zionism, which is the biggest cause of hatred in the world today. And it should, and that is widely being recognized. At the moment, we're having demonstrations which are getting bigger every week in London, in Edinburgh, in Glasgow, in all the major European cities. I have never known demonstrations of the size that we're seeing. And it's not something that's taken a year in the planning. It's something that has been planned every week. And the crowds are getting more and more angry. And world leaders are calling us anti-Semites, but it's not that at all. Unfortunately, Zionism is now turning Islam into its crosshairs. And I think that unless we Muslims are on our guard, we will be dragged to the start of the same street that ordinary Jewish people were dragged down during Nazism. And that can never be allowed to happen again, although it has in Rwanda, it did in Srebrenica, and it's happening in Gaza. Genocide.
Yvonne, this dissident movement which you're talking about, the reaction, ever increasing crowds in support of, I would say, humanity. You may like to call it in support of Palestine, maybe, but as a reaction, I'm sure you must have witnessed the far right movement as well. And the far right movement, do you think it is being supported as a reaction?
Well, one of the leaders of the far right in Britain is a really unsavory character called Tommy Robinson. And he was recently given the red carpet treatment in Israel and treated like a VIP in Israel. He has been funded by Zionists. Elon Musk paid one of the top lawyers money to help Tommy Robinson fight a case against the police, and he won. And we all know the truth is that if you can afford the best lawyer, you will get the best delivery of justice.
Yeah, that's true.
And he won his case, and then he went to Israel, and as I say, he was given the red carpet treatment. And the rise of the far right in Britain is alarming, and they are using migration as a weapon, and they have convinced a lot of people that immigrants are the problem. And it's madness. You know, you look at these, there are some really evil people in the far right, that is for sure. But I would say about 90% of those people are people who have nothing, or people who can't afford to make any financial planning. They're living from hand to mouth each day. They can't afford to put bread on the table. And these people who have absolutely nothing are being wound up and pitted against another group of people who have absolutely nothing. And they are the migrants who don't know where their next meal is coming from, who are reliant on charity. And you see the people who have nothing protesting outside these awful hotels that are housing migrants on the inside. And so you've got people on the outside with nothing, shouting and screaming at people on the inside who have nothing. And the real villains are those tax avoiders and tax evaders who are in the fabulously wealthy sector. And they're the enemy, but it suits the politicians to have both sides of penniless people fighting each other. And the reality is, I don't think that there are that many racists that are with the far right. I think that they have just been groomed and persuaded wrongly through propaganda in the media that migrants are the problem. And I wonder at the, they're complaining that billions are being spent on hotels. At one point, the previous government had planned to fly migrants out to Rwanda. And that was a disgraceful exercise. They spent over £200 million, an eye-watering sum, to investigate and see if it was possible to send migrants to Rwanda.
Yeah.
That's an eye-watering sum of money. And it turned out that had they been successful, they wouldn't have been able to ship more than 200 migrants to Rwanda in the first year. Now, just recently, I've been to Libya, and it's quite clear to me that Libya is playing a huge role, reluctantly or otherwise, in the movement of African migrants into Europe. Surely it would be financially more astute to invest 200 million in communities in Libya to try and stop the flow of migrants, or go right back to the heart of the problem, which is poverty in Africa, a continent that should be so rich, but which has been plundered and looted, and still is being plundered and looted by various Western colonizers. And go into those African communities and talk with the tribal elders and say, you're losing all your young men. What can we do to persuade you to keep them at home? Is it building schools? Is it building universities? Is it training them in engineering, in medicine. You know, how can we make your life better and improve your economy that makes your people want to stay? Because eventually these communities are going to have no young men. And a community without young men is not going to move forwards. So, you know, we should be looking to try to help various economies. I know that I can't remember which country it is in Africa, but there's one African leader that is banning students from going overseas for education because he said it's creating a brain drain. So the brightest, most talented youngsters are leaving his country. They're being educated in Europe or America, and they're not returning. And that is causing this brain drain. And that's why he's stopping it. So, you know, there are.
Do you support that decision, though?
I don't think that people should be punished for being bright and winning scholarships. I don't think people should be punished at all. But at the same time, some of the most highly educated kids in the Middle East come from Palestine. Why? Because they see education as a key to get them out of living under a brutally oppressive regime. But the trouble is, if Palestine loses all of its bright young minds, then what of its future? And I know that, you know, there are so many orphans in Gaza at the moment that could probably get a loving home overnight because so many people around the world want to help them. But the worst thing they can do is take all the orphans out of Gaza, because that is the next generation to build Palestine. And what people don't understand is that the people in Palestine have a special affinity with the land. We've seen homes being bombed and families return, and they start building plastic shelters and tents on the rubble of their homes. And their immediate instinct is to rebuild. Now, when Iran was bombing Israel, and don't forget, Israelis all have a bomb shelter within running distance to be safe. As soon as the bombs started dropping and piercing the so-called Iron Dome, the Israelis fled. In the end, the government shut down Ben Gurion Airport in Tel Aviv to stop the exodus. They then took boats and sailed to Cyprus, and they're now setting up home in Cyprus, causing all sorts of consternation to the Greek Cypriots there. So as soon as the bombs dropped, the Israelis wanted to flee. Well, the Palestinians never left Gaza. Many of them refused to leave Gaza. Donald Trump thought he could just move them off to another country, possibly for a better life. but they wouldn't leave Gaza because they are attached to the land. And this attachment goes back centuries and centuries. But for the Israelis, many of them white European settlers, they couldn't wait to get out quick enough. And the net effect of that has been a huge increase in size to various Jewish communities around the world, where they've moved back to be with their families and see their future out of Israel. And, you can't blame them. There was an article written by a Zionist in Haaretz, which is a newspaper of regard in Israel. And he said, these Palestinians are crazy. They're never, ever going to go. So maybe we should. And that is the first time I've seen someone express such an opinion in a mainstream newspaper in Israel. And he was giving a very articulate argument for Israelis to pack their bags and leave because the Zionist project has failed. And I think that is what will happen. Again, going back to the propaganda, if the truth was told in the media in Israel, there would be an exodus overnight. The truth is that more kids are refusing to be conscripted into the IDF, into the military. More soldiers are wanting to be out of the military. They didn't sign up for what they've been asked to do. One military cemetery is full to capacity now, and it wasn't expected to be so for a few years. And they are having to find bigger cemeteries to bury their dead. The Iron Dome is not the safe defense system that people believed it to be. The Iranians reckon that they have developed a missile which can penetrate the dome. How true that is, I don't know. But there's so much information out there that if people just used their common sense, they would realize that, there were big celebrations in Israel a couple of years ago when the population exceeded 10 million. It's below 9 million now, but they refuse to even do a head count. 60,000 small businesses have closed down. When I was taken into Ashdod Port should have been teeming with life. It was dead. The only boats coming in were the boats from the flotilla that had been seized illegally by Israel. And that's another thing for Israel to continue to survive. It has to continue to commit war crimes. And sooner or later, those war crimes will be held to account in The Hague. And already Benjamin Netanyahu and Itamar Ben-Gvir have both got war crimes charges against them. And this is really serious. Suddenly the ICC is no longer being used to prosecute Black African leaders. It's now focusing its attention on Israel, thanks to South Africa. And South Africans are realizing that they will be punished, no doubt through tariffs, the buzzword of Donald Trump. And I was in South Africa a couple of weeks ago, and I said, if you suffer because of sanctions imposed on South Africa because of its war crimes position, count that as a badge of honor and stand up, and whatever you suffer, you won't be suffering as much as the Palestinians. So put up with it and be proud of your country, because retribution will come. And, you know, it is true.
So, Yvonne, just a second last question to you. If you could speak to the Yvonne Ridley of 2001 as Dr. Yvonne Ridley sitting right now, just before you were captured back then, what would you tell her?
Well, as I say, I wasn't a particularly bad person. I would definitely say stop drinking. You know, one of the things that especially musicians and writers and artists believe in is that alcohol stimulates the creative buzz. It doesn't. I've written some of my finest pieces stone cold sober. So stop drinking. There's a reason why drinking is haram in Islam. If you go to any police station in the West on a night time and you check the cells, more than half the occupants inside, I bet, would be there through alcohol abuse. And alcohol abuse leads to domestic violence, it leads to crime, it leads to unclear thinking. And, you know, this is one of the reasons that in Islam, drinking is haram, because our bodies were created by Allah, and we should take care of that creation. And alcohol is one of the most toxic drugs that destroys the body, attacks all of the organs, ages the skin, destroys the liver, attacks the kidneys, brings on heart disease. It's not good for us. So I've always found it quite interesting that, you know, once I started to follow Islam, I knew that eventually I would embrace Islam. I didn't think it would be as soon as I did, but I knew that I would have to stop drinking. And I remember being in my flat in London, and I thought, tomorrow I'm going to stop drinking. So tonight I'm going to have one bender and that will be it. And I remember opening a bottle of vodka, except I couldn't open the screw top. And the threads had got knotted, and the screw top was just going round and round and round, and I couldn't take it off. So I then went to the kitchen drawer and I got a knife, and I'm trying to cut through the screw threads, and I cut myself. And there was a lot of blood, but it was just a finger cut. And I just thought, this is God's way of saying, do it now, stop drinking now. So I went to see my neighbor and I said to him, here's a bottle of vodka. There's something wrong with the screw top. You can't get it off. But I said, I am finished with drinking. And he said, yeah, that'll be right. But he took the bottle. And I've never touched a drop since, not knowing
Wow.
you anyway. I mean, as far as I'm aware, I have not touched a drop of alcohol since. And once I was able to stop drinking, which turned out to be remarkably easy for me anyway, I knew that it wouldn't be long before I could embrace Islam. But I realized that I couldn't convert to Islam and still drink the amount of alcohol that I used to drink. So yes, that's what I would say to my younger self. Stop drinking. Because, we use all sorts of excuses for alcohol. Oh, it'll make me stronger. Well, it won't. In fact, I've become probably more outspoken and more fearless since I stopped drinking. And I'm really quite proud of myself, because you think, oh, I need a stiff drink to be able to go out and tell them what I think. Yeah. And I don't have that now. I think a lot of it had to do with the experience in Afghanistan, because when you think you're going to die, what else is there to be scared of? What there is, it's the last frontier. And I think that's why when there are times of trouble, pensioners stand up and do incredible things, and you think, gosh, look how brave they are. And I think it's because of their age and their wisdom and their realization that we're all going to die at some time, some of us sooner than later. And to hell with it, I'm not going to worry about it anymore. And I don't. I'm not afraid. When it happens, it will happen. Hopefully not for a long time. I love living.
Yeah.
But I love life. I've got a very blessed life at the moment. But I'm not looking over my shoulder and afraid to die.
So, concluding this discussion, Yvonne, do you believe humanity is heading towards a clash or a spiritual awakening?
Well, sometimes I think, when I see Sydney Harbour Bridge jammed to capacity with pro-Palestinian supporters, and streets in Europe being brought to a halt, I think humanity is rising. But then I see the demonstrations outside the migrant hostels and hotels, and I think humanity is imploding. I think something seismic is going to happen, and that will either bring us all to our senses, and the signs are there. The election of the New York mayor, that was huge. Yeah. And I think the same thing could happen in the elections in May that are coming in Britain. But the AIPAC, which is the pro-Zionist lobby, spent tens of millions of dollars to destroy the New York mayor's chances of winning. And the amount of Islamophobia that rose up, and you can't, he's a terrorist, he's this, he's that. Every bit of dirt that they could throw at him, they threw at him. And I can't remember his name now, and I should.
Mamdani.
Yes. What an amazing victory that was. And I believe that we will see victories like that right across Europe and America. And Donald Trump, I fear for him, because the MAGA crowd are turning against him. And they rose up and swept him to power. And they will remind him that as easy as he can be swept to power, he can be taken away from power. And I think one of his biggest errors to date is somebody who you mentioned at the beginning of this show, and that is Tony Blair.
Yeah.
Selecting Tony Blair as a governor of this imperialist, colonialist crackpot idea he has to turn Gaza into prime realty estate. Tony Blair is despised throughout the Middle East. And when you make a suggestion that is so ridiculous, people react. And in the souks across the Middle East, when they were told Tony Blair is being tipped to be the governor of Gaza, there were derisions of laughter, hoots of laughter. Even the rulers and the despots who have a stranglehold in the Middle East just laughed. But that laughter will soon turn to anger. And I am convinced that the Arabs will rise up. It has to come, and I would say it could come in Saudi, because MBS has, the de facto leader, the Crown Prince, has stripped his people of just about everything worthwhile. Freedom of speech, freedom to act, freedom to live where you want, the building of these impossibly high buildings, and stripping the Bedouin of their lands, and building in Al-Ula, which, the Holy Quran states should never be built on, should never be developed, should not be lived in. And the previous occupants were wiped out. And once the fear goes, the people will rise up. And that fear will eventually go. Something will happen. And I have a feeling that if Saudi is the first Arab country to implode, a lot of Muslims will travel across the world to Saudi to help their brothers and sisters retake the Arabian Peninsula. And I believe that that will happen. Maybe not in my lifetime, but I think I've got a few years yet. And the world is in a very fragile place. And the whole world order is changing now as well. America is not the superpower it once was. The G7 countries, their economy is now competing with BRICS. Brazil, India, China, the other countries that are forming BRICS, South Africa, their economy is starting to grow. And I think once it grows much faster, than the G7 economies, we will see quite a tumultuous event. Whether it's man-made, people-led, I'm really not sure. But I have a good feeling that things will get better. But unfortunately, the hour before the dawn is the darkest, so maybe there's even worse to come yet. But Gaza was pretty bad. I think Gaza has pricked the conscience of the world.
So the clash has led to a spiritual awakening. That's your verdict?
Yes, yes.
All right, all right. So thank you so very much, Dr. Yvonne Ridley, for this very candid, spiritually awakening and soul-searching interview. Ladies and gentlemen, do leave your comments, and thank you again, Dr. Yvonne Ridley, for joining us today.
Thank you.